Hey, and welcome to Beyond the Bodyfucked, Mapping a Politics of Trans Game Studies. I'm Lou, a PhD student at Monash, and I guess I'll get going. So, the throughline of this talk is that while there's been a lot of work recently in queer game studies, and that's really exciting, the deeper I get into thesis work, the less I kind of feel like trans game studies has a seat at this table, and the less I feel like trans game studies should have the same politics or goals as queer game studies. So, what I'm doing in my thesis, and what I kind of want to put to you today, is that I want to try make and argue for a disciplinary break between queer and trans game studies. Now, my intention here is not to talk shit about queer game studies, or to split hairs, or to be contrarian, or whatever. I think trans game studies is fundamentally still allied with queer game studies, and I think trans game studies, importantly, owes a huge debt to queer game studies and the work being done there. But I also think it's important and that it's going to be beneficial to both these projects if we stop pretending they're the same, or that one can kind of neatly encompass the other, when that isn't really the case. So, to get into this, I'm first going to do a quick recap of queer game studies, then talk a little about the broader tension between queer and trans studies, and then, in the time I have left, get into my particular intervention. I'm sorry in advance, this is going to be quite heavy on theory, but I will try and make it interesting. Yeah, so let's start with queer game studies. As a field, it's been kind of experiencing this huge boom in the last few years. And its core idea is basically about, quote, imagining game studies otherwise, by studying games queerly, in addition to studying queer game subjects, end quote. Its aims, as I understand them, are roughly the following. It pushes back against the discipline of game studies and its hierarchies, and also pushes back against mainstream gamer culture and the, quote, neoliberal rhetorics of representation and inclusion, end quote, which would have us be contented by seeing one gay person in one game every year. And this kind of moves towards ideas of queerness beyond representation. This involves, quote, excavating the queer potential that can be found in all games, end quote, and also kind of drawing attention to the fact that queer people have always played and made games. Cool, fantastic. As I said, I think this is a really important field, and it's important for us to get our gay hands on games and make a lot of white men angry. And there is some trans work being done under the aegis of queer game studies. I'm not claiming to be the first person applying trans theory to games, and I'm definitely not the only trans person in game studies, but I think I probably am the first person trying to put together a kind of coherent tool set for doing trans game studies, because what is there at the moment is pretty scattered and kind of lacks a coherent methodology or identity. And this, I think, I would argue, stems in part from the fact that trans game studies, as it stands, is pretty much entirely subsumed by queer game studies. And, well, queer and trans studies are not the same. This might sound blatantly obvious to you, but it's probably less obvious where that matters, particularly if you aren't trans. So, this is not kind of just a clicky you can't sit with us moment. And there's an important precedent for what I'm saying here. Namely that there's an established tension between queer and trans studies more broadly, and there has been for a while. I could go on about this for ages, but I have 10 minutes, so here are a couple of problems with how queerness deals with transness. One is that queer studies continues to take sexuality as the primary point of difference. To quote, all too often, queer remains a code word for gay or lesbian, and all too often, transgender phenomena are misapprehended through a lens that privileges sexual orientation and sexual identity as the primary means of differing from heteronormativity, end quote. Or else it's prone to casting the trans person as the ultimate queer, regardless of the precarious lived experiences of many real actual trans people, especially trans people of colour. And not only is the product of trans studies definitively different from queer studies, or for that matter, women's studies, but it actively values making a break from these methodologies. So it makes sense to me to kind of follow this fault line where it cuts through the territory of game studies. Turning these problems onto queer game studies, then. I think my big problem with it is that it's far too broad to satisfyingly encompass transness. In particular, I think that if all games have latent queer potential waiting to be dug up, regardless of whether they have queer content or themes or sympathies, you hit a point where queerness becomes so diffused that it loses its power. If queerness is premised fundamentally on being non-normative, and if every game can then be said to have some kind of non-normative potential, the flip side is that no game can really be said to meaningfully contain this potential anymore. And though all games may contain queer potential, I don't think all games contain trans potential. I also don't think I want them to. I'd argue that while it does risk being too prescriptive, it's important to be more rigorous about our criteria for trans potentiality in games. To do that, I think we need to kind of consider what a point of commonality between all trans lives might look like. But if there's one definitive factor, what is it? Trans people are an incredibly diverse group, and no two trans experiences are the same. Factors that differentiate trans lives include assigned gender at birth, race, class, access to medical care, age, ability, mental illness, whether or not they decide to transition, and the actual steps that are taken in that process. And that's just naming a few of the many, many factors. So, with the disclaimer that I'm white, middle class, and able-bodied, I would argue that the key trans experience is a sort of fundamental oppositionality to your own body, which begins on the level of gender, but doesn't end there, and which can never be fully addressed. It can be eased through a social and medical transition, but it cannot be erased. And this is what I coin the state of being bodyfucked, the state of having an inaddressable, irreconcilable sense of bodily fracture. To theorise this, I'm kind of working at the intersection of trans studies and disability studies, which obviously have a lot of sympathy for each other, as disciplines about non-normative embodiment. In particular, I'm using the work of the scholar Cameron Awkward-Rich, and the moves that he makes towards disability studies to help make sense of transness. One of his big kind of contributions that I'm making use of is that he singles out the role of bad affect in the trans experience. That is, being trans inherently makes you feel kind of like shit, and that's just how it is. But this isn't a source of undiluted pessimism. In response, we can take a position which lets us commit to both, quote, the idea that trans lives are lived, hence livable, while also taking feeling bad as a mundane fact, end quote. That is, we can sit with both the bad feeling produced by our transness and the larger problem of having a body at all, without feeling the need to rehabilitate it or try to smooth it over. Turning to games then, and if we take bad affect and the idea of being body fucked as the core of trans experience, I would suggest 3 separate but linked criteria for what games with trans potentialities look like. 1, that they give us a body that feels consistently ludicrously fucked on the level of control schemes. 2, a body that's constructed as fucked, or at least different, by the fiction in the world of the game. And 3, meaningful crossover between these aspects. So, what does this look like in terms of actual games? Not to sound like somebody from the early 2000s, but I do think it's pretty central to kind of pick out both the ludic and narrative aspects here. So games that have both these factors and also do it consistently. And this also kind of resists the neoliberal logics picked out by queer game studies, where AAA games will tell you your body is trans to win diversity points, without engaging meaningfully with questions or experiences of transness. For example, we might point to a recent effort by a big-name franchise to feature non-binary characters, when the trans bodies this game presents still walk and talk and do war crimes the way that cis bodies would. My own work looks at visual novels, but I haven't got time to really talk about that at the moment, and I kind of did touch on an early version of it at this conference last year. But the bottom line is that most VNs don't really provide a clean entry point for the player, because they offer little control over the protagonist in a conventional sense. So, playing a VN with any kind of real quote-unquote immersion kind of requires negotiating between on-screen bodies you can't really possess, while also abandoning your own body to a degree to be able to get absorbed. Obviously, my point here is not that all VNs are trans, because VNs are a really diverse group of games as well, and also people kind of bandy around the term VN so much that nobody knows what it means anymore. But this is all another talk. So I'm still kind of working on what I'm doing at the moment, and I have more theory about this stuff, but I haven't got time to really dig into it. So I guess I'll move to the recap, which is that queer game studies exists, and that's important and great. Trans game studies work is being done, but I think it suffers from trying to be part of queer game studies instead of trying to break away a little bit, in line with kind of the larger tension between these two fields. And my suggested starting point for a break would be to focus on the body fucked and modes of embodiment in games which aren't interested in smoothing over bad affect, or the fact that having a body, especially a trans body, is fundamentally a messy, complicated thing. Cool. If you want to talk to me about this paper or ask about my sources, here's how, and thank you very much.